Thank you so much, Russell. Thank you for inviting me and just assembling this wonderful group. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you both thus far. And yeah, to the gallery for hosting this. Very excited to be inaugurating talks back at the gallery. That's very cool. The show's fantastic. Go spend time in there. I mean, it's been such a joy to just be in there and speak with you, Phyllida, and get your take on it as well, Sharon. So please spend time after the talk. It's fabulous. So I wanted to start on this idea that, Phyllida, you've talked about. And I think, Sharon, from your perspective, there's so much, I mean, the whole hour talk, we could just focus on this idea of these kind of protagonists that you talk about, Phyllida, and almost wrestle against of the architecture, the audience, and the object, and kind of this meeting of this trifecta of sort of forces. And I've heard you say, like, where is one going to kind of win out on the other? What's that negotiation? So I thought we could start there. And Sharon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those three elements as well. Yes, please.
I think the work begins in the studio in a very traditional way, making small models, loads of drawings, and then building the work very collaboratively, the large works, with a team who need to be fully recognized in the process of this, as does the team here for the installation, for which I'm extremely grateful, such an incredible team. But that whole process in the studio is private and intimate. There's lots of coming and going with the work. Things fall down and break, things don't work out. Yeah. You know, it's a very laboratory-like experience, and gradually the works begin to emerge and the structural parts of the work get welded and made in situ in the studio by my production manager, Adam. And then we begin to then collaborate on how we clad these works, etc., etc. The last thing I'm thinking of during that process is the audience.
Right.
And possibly at that moment, I'm not thinking so much about the space. And actually, the protagonists for me are the space, the work, and the audience. It isn't necessarily the architecture. So I'd love to pick your brains about what architecture actually is in relationship.
Just a definition.
Yes, please help me.
But I think it's interesting that it's these three elements, but that for you the object is really what comes primary.
Yes.
And then the other two are confronted in almost this sort of secondary or haphazard way as the work's coming into the space, right?
Yes, it feels very raw. It feels as though I'm going on stage without a script.
Yeah.
I'm not completely confident about how it's going to work out. And especially in the case of this show, the space is so extraordinary with these three different heights, 6 meters, 11 meters, and then 3 meters, the staircase, and of course the columns.
Right.
And in a way, the columns have dictated the work.
Yeah.
They've been the stars of the show in my mind.
Right.
Because when I came here to look at it, a column is a hugely important building device. But the strange thing is they move. You know, you try and see something behind a column, and it very conveniently moves in the opposite direction.
They're shifty.
Yes. So I thought, right, I'm going to trap you. I'm going to catch you, and I'm going to use a platform stage to do that, which I then wanted to be a secondary space, a bit like a ship in a bottle.
Idea, I love that.
You know, to just squeeze this platform into the space to change the doggedness of the floor, you know, and actually quite an awkward, narrow throughway. And also give the columns very much a role, a theatrical role almost. And then to allow the other works to intervene almost in a theatrical way, almost slightly as though they're waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
So
but
that
kind of,
was...
They do step onto the stage a little, right? They kind of penetrate and go,
Yes. So by the time it comes to installing the show, it becomes incredibly collaborative
Yeah.
with my studio assistants, and in this case, the remarkable team from here.
Yeah.
It's no longer the solo artist. It's something more than that.
Yeah.
And then as I'm doing that and I'm trying to maneuver the space in relationship to the work and the work in relationship to space, and there's always this standoff in a way, then I begin to think of the viewer, the audience.
In the midst of that wrestling match, the viewer comes into the mix.
But key to the whole thing is my love of exploring the space, using sculpture and the language of sculpture as a means for exploring above our standard height, to slightly resist, or more than slightly, to resist that kind of eye-level view that I think is what the gallery and the museum often is obliged to do, to take advantage to actually provoke that in some way.
Well, thanks for that, Phyllida. It's so nice to hear you talk about space. And, I think we had the chance to walk through the gallery this morning, and in many ways, the kind of proportion of that room, it's long, it's narrow, there's columns in the middle of it. You would sort of think that's never going to be a great gallery space. It has all the things we're taught not to do. But I think what is so fantastic about Phyllida's, the way she talks about it not being site-specific, but really there's this very specific way she engages space. And I don't know how to exactly answer the question about architecture, but I think what is quite spectacular is how the work, through the platform, through the way you reconfigure the ground, which is the sort of most primitive aspect of architecture, and embrace those columns into your work. It totally, to me, that's architecture in the sense that they become partners in your project, and you're working against them. And I think for us as architects who make spaces for artists to work, it was so interesting kind of spending more time with your work recently, the idea of creating a kind of open space that isn't too determined, that an artist can't come and make it for herself, I think is really amazing. So while this space is maybe not originally designed as a gallery, I love that its imperfections become so generative and embraced in the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something so bold about how you installed in the space, swallowing those columns into the platform, but then also the sight lines. Your work literally kind of segments the columns and goes between them and kind of breaks that repetition. And one of the works absolutely swallows one of the columns, is sort of built around it. So there's this kind of challenge to that austerity of the architecture.
Yes, I mean, maybe there's also, if you like, a kind of emotional, psychological response to the art space, its authority, its didacticism, that this is special, and maybe just in some way to disrupt that, to make these inaccessible spaces become visceral, to become emotive in some way. And hopefully the audience then begins to participate in the act of looking. They're able to look at. They are, in a way, becoming as important as the objects themselves. And I find that the warm-blooded idea of the audience being the moving factor, and the sculpture. I mean, sculpture is the most stupid art form of all the art forms. Still, silent, dumb. It doesn't twitch or move or make a noise. Heavy. Heavy. Impossible.
Right.
Every day. In a world of many twitching, fidgeting, visual things, a lot of visual noise, to suddenly have these heavy, in a way dull by nature, but the thing that ignites them is the warm-fleshed encounter with their kind of opposites, the human. And I find that a very important, my love of sculpture is because it is this silent, still form, and that, you know, often it's not beautiful, often sculpture can confront the ugly and give it a lease of life that's possibly not thought of. It can indulge in ugliness, it can indulge in all sorts of very visceral aspects, not only in the finished object, but in the making. You're getting filthy, dirty, you're dealing with liquid materials that want to do their own thing and don't want to obey what you want to do, etc. It's noisy, so it's arriving at this final stillness and silentness. It leaves behind this sort of wreckage in a way, and I'm just as interested in that. I'm interested in the quagmire of the processes. And
well, I'm curious to talk about that and get Sharon's thoughts, because even when we walked in this morning, Sharon's like, do you think she does a maquette? And that, like, coming from an architect's point of view, the sort of absence of a plan or absence of a maquette, and how you're talking about this process being just like wildly, you know, kind of erratic in a way, versus kind of maybe how you work, Sharon.
Oh, that's completely terrifying. No maquettes, no plan, no. But I mean, I think another, maybe a way to respond to that I found powerful about the installation was that, and I think this gets at what you're talking about, Phyllida, that in a way, both the work itself and the way that it engages the space, it sort of makes us become more aware of the imperfections, both of the architecture, the things that we think are stable and ordered and somehow finite. The way that your work engages them, it sort of loosens that up in a way I think it makes us look really carefully at things in a way that you wouldn't in another kind of environment. So I find that intertwining that I think you're talking about between the audience and the work, you know, this sort of roughness and rawness it opens it up. And I think it also does it to the space. I find that not all architecture can receive that and be activated by it. But I find that particularly beautiful here and very different than I was just in London a couple months ago and saw some of your work. And it's not a perfect gallery, but it's much more finished than this. And the dialogue is so different.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
Yeah, maybe, Phyllida, you could talk about that context and how you approach installing in very different spaces, and if you think the work shifts within those contexts, or is it more of kind of a response to the work? Like you're saying, the sort of sculpture in this space brought about kind of a new approachability to this space, or kind of showed its flaws in a way. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on context. And
yes, I mean, I think the most terrifying space for me is the pristine white cube. And I've got that coming up in September or October.
Full of bronzes.
Yeah, bronzes and white rooms.
That's next year. Yes, yes, so it's then it becomes, I think, both emotional and in a way quite aggressive. Maybe I've had a problem with the white cube space for many years. I think a lot of artists work for many years without showing, you know.
Yeah, right.
There's a whole aspect of being an artist which is invisible, which is the enormous anomaly, I think, about being a visual artist and then being invisible. And then the convention is to show in the white cube. But I think my kind of problem with judgment and authority is why that is a prime site. I'm not saying it isn't a prime site. I think being able to show in a white cube is a fantastic experience because it's unforgiving, you know. Yeah. You can't hide in any way, but I think there's also a way of taking it on where perhaps that very rigid space can be challenged by the process that you're bringing to 100%. It.
As we, see in the work with those, how you're interrupting those columns and really challenging the authority of that space.
And it's not just aesthetic sort of throwing a bucket of God knows what around the space and making it filthy. It's actually trying to see the work as having its own autonomy despite where it is.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. I think you said during the talk the other day that there's no difference between a garden shed and the Parthenon or something like that. Just so audacious.
It's a bit of a risky thing.
Yeah.
Probably regret that.
But imagining, and here I am repeating it, but imagining artwork installed in those spaces, like when what that does, an artwork installed in a shed.
Yes, well, I think what I'm sort of trying to say is that does the white cube give it authority?
Right.
Or can the work itself command its own authority? And I think the way we live in societies where there are all sorts of means for giving authority to things and, how we resist that or comply with that. I think the artwork suffers from the same problem. And maybe it's childish or something, but I always want to resist that authority. Yeah. And I think for me, space is highly psychological. I wonder what the whole evolution of space. I know the writer Luce Irigare has written about it, from the cave to the platform and the column. That the cave is the enclosed, in a way, she refers to it as a female space, whereas the platform with the columns is a very masculine, oratorial space. And I suppose, in a way, following on from that, I find the walls of a space command authority, whereas the space between the walls is like the space of rebellion. It's where you can take to the streets. In a way, perhaps that is a sculptural space for me.
But that's why I find the platform strategy, the stage strategy that you show and you have in a lot of your work, and how you talked about it, maybe initially was a horizontal plane, and then it started tilting as you work, and that in this show it completely destabilizes how you read the walls because of the way you've put this new ground in there. And I think that sort of sense of temporality in the way that it's lifted off the ground, you can sort of see underneath it, it's tilting, it's a way, maybe that's your way to sort of challenge the wall by building the floor.
It is by building this secondary space. And also, I think, what's two things. One is, I think sculpture is an incredibly theatrical art form, and I love that. I think it's also devious and manipulative. As we were going round, Sharon very quickly identified where the steel sections of the timbers were, and where the sort of fake wooden ones were, and so this sculpture constantly plays that game. And what is a bronze cast? It's a skin that's probably an inch thick at its thickest, that encloses a huge black space inside it. It's not a solid thing at all, but its aspiration is to be this fantastic solid thing. I think sculpture is constantly playing with manipulating what its reality is, and maybe I enjoy that enormously. The fakery of it, and I think also, the columns in there are real, but I very much like the idea of, as I did in the Venice show, of things being phantom versions of that. So and you think it's a column, and I would probably name it, its studio name would be column. But it's, it's made of paper, it's made of materials that disintegrate. So it's a phantom. It's a charade of a column. And I think that pretending that sculpture does, that must be something that is impossible to do in architecture. Maybe the Baroque has done it, but
the ceiling needs to stay up.
That's stuff like, levitating and spanning, things that seem to belie gravity. But
Yes.
yeah, it's harder to do in I loved how you described it in your studio. You like to make things, break things, toss them over, sort of all the things that we as architects love but have a harder time getting away with.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's something about this also, like the fakery. I want to go back to that idea of these like stand-ins, right? And kind of, I think that's another cheeky way to kind of subvert or almost, push up against the column, make a fake column, and as we were walking through on the second level, there's these lovely kind of more human scaled, larger than humans, but they're kind of anthropomorphic sculptures, and they're right at the top of the stairs on the second level. And again, I feel like that's such a bold kind of, you're stopping here, and it's kind of this affront to both the architecture and the viewer in a way, or almost an invitation to be like, hey, look at me, I'm here, engage with me. It's almost, it's both an affront and sort of a welcoming in a way.
And I think just talking earlier about sort of two components, the structural component and then the organic component, the sort of skeleton and flesh duality, leading to a kind of fascination in opposites. What forms would be the opposite to the stage and these very structural components?
Right.
So I wanted to introduce these standalone objects that have very corporeal bodily identities that in some ways are almost not irrelevant, but they're very different to what else, almost presenting a kind of puzzle. What is this inconsistency about? Why
I mean, with what's on the ground and what's above.
Yes, for me, very much placing the sculptural object as though it's something in waiting. I think there are all kinds of aspects of sculpture in relationship to our experience of objects in the world, things that are put on one side, things that are hidden, things that don't come out of the cupboard for years and years, or
get pushed to the back and other things come in front,
and that actually they gather their own kind of significance because they are on the edge, to the point where you dread going to the cupboard because at some point
it's going to come for you.
Or you've got to be, you've got to take some kind of responsibility for this thing that's there. That objects don't always behave well, they behave in irresponsible ways, and they defy logic. And I think to have had the opportunity here at this exhibition, in a way, to introduce these very bodily, corporeal forms that sort of break with the logic of the stage installation was a great joy for me, because I'm just interested in that, cutting through that.
Can I just ask you a quick question about that? You've written and others have written about these terms like misfits or misunderstandings. Is that related to what you're talking about?
Yes,
sort of things that don't seem to belong.
Yes.
And I think that's very powerful.
And yes, I think it's how the organic form, the invented form, is something that I think, well, I always say that Picasso's glass of absinthe initiated that in the 20th century. And then of course you have Duchamp, who is the sort of genius of the 20th century, and I often say I hate him.
Wow.
Please don't take that too seriously. Because I mean he is the genius of the 20th century, but I think he's often, which probably sounds really arrogant to say this, sort of misunderstood. And he's become this fodder for a kind of PhD culture, and rather than an understanding of his bewitching manipulation of the world around and reclaiming a whole language not only initiating it, but reclaiming the world around and representing it so that other artists could follow on with that. So you have that extraordinary strand in the 20th century. And then you have, you know, the more sculptural, especially in the UK, you know, the whole Henry Moore legacy, which when I was a student was a pretty heavy thing to come up against. There was good sculpture and bad sculpture. There was good form and bad form. There was good drawing and bad. The list was endless.
Right.
You know?
I wonder if that's, sorry to cut you off, I wonder if that's why you work in these dualities so much, because you're pushing against that initial idea in your earlier education of good, bad, you know? It must be like this, it can't be like that, and these rigid kind of boundaries around art making.
And I think there's also then the conflict of actually being wildly in love with that kind of formal language. You know,
right.
and it really being a huge resource for me, you know.
Yeah,
the organic
pulling from it at the same time you're pushing, like rejecting it, pushing it away.
A slightly, a very confused way of appropriating
well, right.
the language of the past, you know, on one hand rejecting it, and on the other hand desperately wanting to use it and be involved with it.
Yeah, and we talked a bit in the gallery about this idea of the macho, right? And how you, why not be macho and kind of appropriate that gesture. But the way you do it, again, it's like this fluidity between the materiality and this macho gesture that you can't tell, is it hard, is it soft, is it heavy, you know, and kind of deflating the macho-ness in a way.
Yes,
as you're also just excited about it being macho and being big, you know.
Or the authority that the macho,
Yeah.
in a very sort of simple way, can command. You know,
Yeah.
it has power, it has strength, it has authority. And, you know, in learning sculpture at art school, which I was hopeless at, but I knew there was something about aggression and forcefulness that attracted me hugely about making sculpture.
Right.
And, then as feminism sort of evolved, there were things that I felt I just couldn't comply with in terms of a feminist language, you know.
Right.
I needed that. I needed to appropriate the macho tradition, whatever that might be, in order to accommodate my temperament and what I loved about sculptural language. You know.
Well, that's another duality, right? Of the kind of feminist work kind of going against the macho. And I think you reject these dualities. You have to kind of take maybe from both or work between those things.
Absolutely,
and, you know, kind of where does that exist on the spectrum? I want to talk about this idea of the new, because that came up in the gallery. And Sharon, would you say you're like, oh, we also hate the new or something?
I did say that.
So I want to start with you then, and what do you mean by that? And I think for Phyllida, it comes in by way of materials, and we were talking a bit about that, but I'd love for you to expand on that a bit, Sharon.
Yeah, I mean, I was obviously being a little bit provocative, but I think, you know, perhaps it's more about a comment about what one aspires to, and I think sort of aspiring to be new and innovative is not a kind of foundation of what we do. I think there's a connection to history in our work that's really important, kind of understanding, continuing to sort of re-look back at history and see it within a contemporary landscape of design thinking. And, you know, we always think that, you know, all the best ideas have already been put out there. It's really about understanding them again and recontextualizing them and putting them in relationship to different circumstance. That's really exciting to us. So things about precedent and type, which I think is somehow you know, this sort of almost primitiveness of things that can then be put in a contemporary situation produces something very exciting to us. And we wouldn't think about it as, it's exciting. It's something we haven't seen before, but it's not about newness necessarily. And
wow.
Is it? I think there's something about renewal. You know, where you're constantly renewing and being surprised by your own experience. You know, you can look at.
I think so, and I love how you talk about. I feel like you've you and others have written about this condition of surprise. Like you want to
Yeah.
keep surprising yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's, at one level, we've been connected to artists and art history for our whole careers. And I think part of that is that sort of way in which artists help us see the world in ways that first of all, we don't see it. And that it especially about materials, I think that's a really strong draw, and something that is so captivating about your work to us, Phyllida, is that the way materials sort of defy expectation in your work, and I think that's really, it's so hard to do in architecture, but we have to keep imagining.
That's wonderful.
I think, is it that in architecture, the end result can be so seamless that you don't actually see the intensity of what has gone in, like joining two sheets of glass together. I can't imagine anything more nightmarish, But I mean, it must be an unending process of trying.
That's why we never like to put two pieces of glass together.
Perfect. Wow.
But, as I was saying earlier, I mean, I always feel I'm a complete traditionalist because I've been working with the same materials for, since the 1960s. And it all goes back to handling clay, and it all goes back to materials that can be crushed, pulled, pushed, anything like that. That's my roots, and I haven't finished exploring that. And I'm not attracted to experimenting with things. It's sort of cowardly attitude, actually. I'm not interested in experimenting with exotic plastics or whatever it may be. I still think there's a hell of a lot that I can do with these very, very sort of basic materials that are also incredibly easy to get hold of.
Right.
I think a word that I think you've used and resonates so much for us is approximation.
Yeah.
The idea that you're
Yes.
moving towards something,
Yes,
but it's
thank
not
you,
finished. It's not stable.
Yes.
It's something that we think about in terms of materials, typologies, and I feel that relates to what you're saying too, that it's never about completing something, but keeping it open, moving towards something.
Yes, I think because maybe another idea I have of myself as an artist is an artist who doesn't have ideas. I have thoughts, I have actions that go on in my head, like something high up or something that's thrown or something that's accumulated. But that lack of idea also leads to the idea of being an artist who doesn't have a subject. And that's what's so compelling about making. There's always a chase, in some way. And that's what keeps me going, There's always that thing that I can never find, that I have to find. And therefore, approximation and guesswork, guessing at something, are hugely important. It's not about, even with the stage where we were making last-minute changes to it, the thought of it in the space was an approximate guess. And I knew I had to have it there, but I knew that when we were finally here, there would be all sorts of changes.
You're probably they're still in your mind. We could change it this way.
It doesn't stop, And,
But I love that connection between both of your work, how you were talking about sort of this recontextual, how do you take these elements that kind of define what a building is and just resituate them? We don't need to reinvent what a building is. It's about how do we kind of take those pieces and kind of give them new context.
Exactly,
and I think for you, that's so much of your work is what can I do with paper today that I didn't do yesterday? And I love that idea of kind of rejecting new materials and technologies and just kind of, there's so much you can do with the sort of language that you've built and the materials that you invest
I think
in.
Sharon mentioned the idea of a limitation
Yeah.
actually being a very rich prompt.
Right.
And but I suppose there's a sort of almost a feeling of shame about that in an age of such digital explosion and digital technologies.
But I think-
so,
Yeah.
creating so many initiatives for
Yeah.
how to make things.
Sure.
And then doggedly sticking to plan A.
But I think that's so kind of renegade, in a way. And it's, again, rejecting that duality and kind of sticking with the kind of original method.
I mean, I think as a young artist, I sort of rejected almost all sculpture, European sculpture, from about 1930 to about 1960.
Right.
Having been deeply immersed in it
Yeah.
when I first went to art school.
Right,
and then
right,
just
right.
saw it as a huge moral endeavor of right and wrong. But over the last sort of 30 years, I've explored it in huge depth, that era between not so much the radical avant-garde, but, quite obscure French sculptors, Swiss sculptors, European sculptors, and in a way looking at that in relationship to the extraordinary impact that American art had on me in the mid to late 60s, which was all through journals,
Sure.
Yeah. And seeing this kind of relationship, strangely, between well-worn traditional processes and production, and then that also being seen in the context of things that are not that, Eva Hesse, or
Sure.
but there's still being something there that is actually very much where the act of making has this enormous history.
Right. And I think that's what's so intriguing about the art world and architecture and creative practices in general is that lineage and that conversation that we're all kind of parts of. And you kind of can't make anything without influence from the past, even if it's subconscious, kind of coming in and being with you in the studio, right?
Sort of archetypal presence.
Yeah. I want to talk about this idea of glimpse, because that's the title of the show. And I know you've talked about, Phyllida, this, I think you said something like, I wish my work could just be walked by quickly. If I could almost have someone just walk by and almost not look at it or see it in the periphery. And I was curious if you could expand on this idea of quickness and glimpse and this sort of fast look. And I think from an architectural standpoint, there's also a feeling you get when you enter a space. And, we're not inspecting all the corners, but there's sort of a energy that's created that I think relates to this idea of quickness and glimpse.
Yes, it's a nice question, isn't it? I think it was the columns again.
Yeah, the columns.
when I came to look at the space, and I was sort of moving to see the works that were there, and catching a glimpse of, which is a lovely phrase, I think. And
catching
what is retained when you catch a glimpse, whether it's a memory or moving quickly past something. And when I did the Tate Devine exhibition, I very much thought of it, because it's such a long corridor, I thought of it as work that is walked past quickly. That was almost its sort of subtitle. This isn't work to stand and ponder in front of. This is work where it might just be there in the periphery of your vision, a presence, And it made me very interested in that, how we do look at things, and the quickly seen in relationship to also the quickly made, the gesture where you just throw the cloth onto the structure at the end. And getting that gesture right. What is it, 5 seconds it takes, but it may take 2 or 3 attempts to do that. An interest in something which, in a way, I would also almost say is kind of anti-craft. It's about the incidental. It's about, again, that word, catching something, catching it off guard. And I am interested in bringing that to sculpture, which seems the medium that could reject that, in some way.
I mean, I think one thing that makes me think, and we were talking about this, Phyllida, you said, yes, you can throw the paint on the floor and it takes 5 seconds, but it's actually 50 years of practice that first gives you the courage to do that and kind of have the intuitive intelligence. And I think part of the issue of glimpse and somehow perception is also a time thing. The time is so integral. Even if you have a glimpse, which seems momentary, it's 5 hours later when it comes back to you that you maybe understand it differently than.
Totally.
And
exactly,
I think for us as architects, it's such a slow art. So the idea of perhaps at first something is confusing or not understandable, but sort of through time and through repeated experience and duration, it becomes somehow profound and deeper. And I think to me what's interesting about the glimpse is that it offers something initially, but it also needs to be good enough that you want to keep thinking about it and find it and keep moving towards it.
I think that's such a great point, because the thing that's seen quickly then may take a very long time to enact. And then it becomes like, is this just artifice enacting this glimpse thing? Where does the affectation come in? Or where is the kind of real gesture?
But that's why I find, this show so incredible, because how you don't tell us how to move, but you offer these different ways to move and see the work differently, upstairs, downstairs. So it's sort of the layers of glimpses that seem to be what really is how the kind of idea gets embodied.
And I think with glimpse, there's also this idea of memory, right? And how memories can be faulty. And I love how you said remembering the glimpse after the fact. And it has to be strong enough to kind of hold your attention and hold your memory. But then memory is an approximation. Like you're talking about sculptures are approximations, so. But I do think in this space, like you're saying, there's so many angles that we get to see of the work that you're kind of trying to remember how you saw it before and how your neck craned up to look at the sculpture, but now we're seeing it from above, and you're always kind of challenging your own memory of the work from 5 minutes ago as you're going to the next floor.
I think that was something that attracted me to sculpture. Actually, as much as the process of remembering, the process of forgetting. That you forget what you've just seen, that it's a 360-degree art form. Therefore, you're forgetting the whole time. As you're moving around. And therefore, there are all kinds of sentient experiences that you're trying to hold on to, a bit like film. I mean, I think film and sculpture are kind of somehow share a lot in terms of what you were just saying, the process of moving on, constantly moving, and trying to then hold on to, and trying to make a glimpse become a gesture. What is a gesture? I think that is a resource that has all sorts of problematics in it,
Wait, can you repeat that? That a gesture can be problematic, or?
Yes, because I think if you become, I don't know, is a gesture something that you can only do once?
Yeah, right.
And the minute you start repeating it, it's no longer a gesture. It's a style, or it's it
becomes a canon.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't be so harsh as to say that, but I think the mannerism of what was once a thrill, a gesture, and I think with lots of things in the work that from a very early on stage, like binding the joints with plaster and screw, finding that such an immediate way of being able to make quite a large structure very quickly. And I've used that over the last 60 years.
But I think,
that's maybe sort of saved it from becoming its own well-worn cliches, because it actually does a fantastic job of work.
It works.
It works.
Yes.
It's structural. And I think your work has such an urgency to it as well. I really feel like in the making, like there's just this urgency, and that idea of wrapping is just this kind of immediate solution that is fast and you can do it. And as we were talking about earlier, it's an accessible activity that anyone can wrap a thing.
Yes, absolutely. And that aspect that sculpture doesn't have to be something that's a deep, dark secret of
Right. Trade
incredibly
secrets, yeah.
skillful things.
Right.
It can actually be. I said to somebody the other day, yes, all this work could actually be made on your kitchen table.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Just a little smaller.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But it isn't complicated in
Yeah.
that respect.
Well, and you've also talked about height happening through accumulation, right? So it's like the parts, each part is
my size.
is your size, right? So it almost could be kitchen table.
So it's not an obsession with hugeness in
Yeah.
that respect. It's
Yeah.
an obsession with climbing the adventure of
Right.
manipulating space.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
I love that. I have about 100 more questions, but I think we're going to open it to the audience. I'm happy to keep going, but yeah, I'd love to open it up.
Thank you for that. I was curious, when I show your work to students, they always go, but it's so big. And I always sort of say I don't think it's about size so much as about scale. You engage your locations through scale, and I'm curious about that difference. And also, if scale is at all in architecture, how important it becomes. So it's kind of a question for both of you, like how scale plays into your work versus size. Because you said you could put it on a kitchen table, and maybe it wouldn't be that different. It's just a different scale. So I'm curious about that difference.
I meant really that each component is, and the techniques employed are very, almost domestic actually in some respect. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it's an interesting question. And, you know, I think scale is something that for us is also really related to, you know, qualities of materiality and kind of degrees of abstraction. You know, I don't know if you're from LA and if you've seen our project at UCLA, the Graduate Art Studios campus, but it's tilt-up concrete walls and it almost has no detail at all. So the kind of sense of scale is very ambiguous, and I think that's something that in different ways in different projects is important to us, especially in a place for making, that it somehow can be, depending on what you're doing there, the feeling of the scale of the space changes quite a lot, and part of that is through how we try to work with material to reveal or conceal that perception of scale.
I think there's a fascinating, well, in my head, fascinating difference and similarity between scale and size. I often think scale is illusionary and size is the reality, you know, and the two get crossed over in some way. You know, size does fascinate me because that's what the reality is, whereas the illusion can make things look, you know, you can put a tiny object in the middle of a huge space and that object can take ownership.
Right.
You can put a huge object in a huge space and it has sort of has no impact whatsoever because it is just simply cannot be big enough.
And it goes back to the idea of context, right? Of kind of where these things are in. It's all contextual of what's around it, and
therefore size is such a crass reality.
Right.
And
you can't change size.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But with scale, you can do all sorts of intriguing. Again, I think it's and it's not illusion, but the manipulative side of a creative process, you know, that it's sort of relevant to what else is going on around. I mean, how much space does a particular object need, and how can you maybe argue with what it thinks it needs? You know?
Give it less space or more space.
Exactly,
Yeah.
And how can something that's, you know, 30 centimeters tall suddenly appear massive or threatening, and all those other qualities.
I love that. Nice, great question. Anyone else? Maybe. Oh.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible pleasure to follow your talk. Since you were talking about the dictate of the columns and the authority of the walls, how you react to that, would be interested in how was your work for the Bavarian State Opera? So working with the central perspective, and also knowing the immovable audience is like looking on from one perspective only, but also if the temporality, so not the glimpse, an opera like this opera was like about 4 hours, I think. And
Right.
how did you react to this temporality?
It was like the ultimate challenge, and it was just the most amazing experience, because the director of the opera house said he didn't want a stage set from me, he just wanted sculpture. And so suddenly I was working with a very pictorial space,
Yeah.
but all the sculptures moved. So in a way they became, in this very restricted space, they became very, very three-dimensional. And that was really calling my bluff, because I'm so interested in sculpture as a performative theatrical experience, and suddenly they were being asked
To
be that.
perform. Yeah.
Yes, it was, and
Terrified.
they had to do it for real. So it was a way of my. I think one can talk a lot about nonsense as an artist, and I'm sure I do, because there's a love for talking, because it's like a release. You know, you're not explaining the work necessarily, but you can talk about the work. But suddenly in the opera, the talking had to stop. It became a completely new reality to put a piece of sculpture on the stage, the sculpture made in the opera house workshops. Everything that I sort of treasure and think is hugely important was carefully removed from the stage by stage until they were just these performing objects. And
Wow.
I think the main thing it's left me with is that the performative aspect of sculpture is incredibly important to me, but it doesn't necessarily have to go the whole way there, although I would love to do that. Again, I would really love. Are you from Munich? Or no?
From Germany.
Germany, yeah.
So, but of course, like opera, especially people talk about like what in architecture is not like allowed, also the proximity, everything.
Yeah.
Opera would say no.
No, absolutely. You're so right. Yeah, yeah. And that was very, very testing for me. And everything was done digitally on the computer. But
Oh, wow.
programs I didn't even know existed that could pick up the slightest thing. So my next desire is the ring cycle.
Right.
To go the whole hog, you know.
That's wonderful. Do we have another question?
If you reinstall this piece in a museum, or if someone bought this piece and there's no columns, do you reconfigure the piece? Do you rethink it?
Yes, I probably
It's
would,
not
yes.
essentially-
Yeah,
yeah.
It would change, and I think there are works that I have reinstalled, certainly in the Haus der Kunst in Munich, reinstalled a work for the third time, and it was a completely new work, really, and I think that generates its own problems as to what is the work, and maybe makes me even more interested in the work that is about certain qualities of sloping, danger, an underneath and an on top, or whatever it might be. Not necessarily its subject, but its actual, the way it performs, become even more important, that you can do this performance in different
Yeah.
places as you can with an opera. You know, it doesn't change the core qualities of that opera, and it doesn't change the core qualities of the work. The work just becomes something different and can take on the space in a different way. But it's a great question. Yes, it's something I'm still working out, you know, how to.
Unfinished and fleeting and ephemeral, and will it come around differently or change? And what moved you to working in that way? Was it a fear of
When I'm talking about space as a psychological experience, I'm meaning it in a very literal way. Does this space bring up an emotion for you that you can actually nail in some way, or is it a sentient sensation of guardedness, whatever it is? And I think it's maybe not, going back to approximation, it's actually not, in my case, not trying to nail things down. I'm trying to find a subject for my work, and I strongly feel that the subject lies in the actions of making. Yes, exactly. Yes. So it's in a way constantly refreshing that, trying to keep that ambiguity and that lack of resolution alive, rather than it becoming battened down. Oh, eureka, I finally know that my work is about my childhood and the time I got lost, or whatever it might be.
That glimpsed memory of who knows how it's that subconscious kind of polished.
Yes, I like the idea of extreme fluidity, that things come and go, memories come and go, and things are triggered and untriggered, and that it's a huge collective narrative the whole time. And the work sort of emerges out of that in quite an unknowing way. But it's the actions and the processes of doing things that, it's very bodily in a way, it's almost like absorbing and ejecting, it's not static in that there is an ultimate goal, but thank you.
I can't help but think that you came out to the space and you got what necessary information to begin your work. And then have you ever gone to that position, gone back to your studio in London, and then when the work is sent back, you look at it and go, there's some things I probably would have changed had I been able to, it's a far distance to be able to come back and look at it frequently and be in the space. How is it that you can carry all of that information with you to go back to your studio and create what it is you need to do?
Because I get obsessed with numbers like the height, length, really in quite a crazy way. And it's such a good question. But that, there's always something restless in me about looking at the finished, in inverted commas, work, and it provides an incentive the whole time to continue or retry things. There's the curator sitting at the back there, Edith Levene, who curated my show at the Royal Academy. And this show is actually a kind of spawned off version of that. There were things about that show which was a wonderful opportunity as well, like here. And oddly enough, a very similar space where you go in and you have to walk round. But there were things that I felt I could have approached in another way that I've been able to carry out here. And now I've done them here, there are things just beginning to
Percolate.
exactly. Unhitch in my mind that maybe there's another version of them. I think I don't make things that have a resolution. I enjoy that feeling that things are always either mentally unfinished or literally physically unfinished. There are other ways
And there's
of going about it, but it is dimensions and drawing endless diagrams of those dimensions, making the small versions and doing loads of drawings. It's a very, very traditional practice. Is that the same for you?
I think so. There's so many, I think as an architect, not every project is realized either. There's competitions, there's projects that don't. Exactly. And I think being able to construct in one's narrative and the discourse around making your work the kind of ongoing lineage of whether they're just ideas or literal aspects of projects, is, I mean, it is what that restlessness you describe as, you know, how you keep going. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
thing. That's the,
Yeah.
that's the kernel that if you don't have it, you're not moving forward. So.
But I think that's quite important. If it's missed, it's missed.
Yeah.
And it will have to be dealt with in the moment of coming here. So I don't think, again, it's approximation. I'm not a perfectionist. I might be an obsessive, but I'm not a perfectionist. And therefore, if something has gone slightly awry, there's the challenge of then, you know, working with those ingredients of the space. I mean, empty space to me is like a block of clay. It's something to be burrowed into, and it's not static. It's a material in its own right. So all those problems are, you know, are actually nourishment, you know. And certainly, you know, this city is, just got to say it for the last time, my description of Los Angeles is a nervous system, but without a brain. And I don't mean that insultingly to it. I just mean that it's like the neurons are, everything is alert and alive and moving. And it's very different from London.
Yeah.
So just holding that atmosphere in my head whilst I was making the work, I don't think it influenced the work, but it was a matter of absolute fascination and joy to bring the work to this incredible city, which I think is just amazing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Phyllida and Sharon. It's been such, honestly, a pleasure